You may recall that in episode number 1, we took a look at creating a basic iOS application that we have running in the emulator here, though we've made a couple of adjustments to it. We've fleshed out the code just a little bit more and added some logic that allows us to now enter the value into the decimal field and automatically have it update the value in the other fields using the relative and correct value. We're not dealing with the binary value yet. We're going to hold that off for just a little bit and maybe talk about categories of objects in our next episode, which will give us a good opportunity to see a simple way to generate that binary value. But for now, I can see that I can simply enter in the arbitrary value here and instantly get that value to update within the other fields. However, the update does not occur dynamically. In fact, it's not occurring until after I finish editing that field. So one of the first challenges that you might like to overcome is, how can I make it so that when I make a change, it actually dynamically updates the other fields? Well, let's see how we do that. Let me close out of the emulator and come on back to our editor. There are actually a couple of different approaches that we can take to this problem. Let's start by bringing up the inspector over here and look at the connections inspector for the decimal value field. Now, the decimal value field from our last episode is hooked up to the decimal value changed action function within our implementation file. If I take a look, these other fields currently do not have any actions that are connected, and that's simply because we don't need them for our demonstration. Though in the long run, we would really like to make it so that we can make an entry into any field and have the values change. Let's focus on just the decimal field for now, though. What I want to do is make it so that as I make changes to this field, it dynamically updates the changes in the other field. It turns out that in my implementation file, the decimal value changed function could actually take care of that for us. The problem is that it's not being called as changes are being made. You can see here that it's simply taking that master value from whichever field is currently sending it. It's this function. And in this case, that happens to be the decimal value field, the only one that's linked to it. And based on that value, it's then simply populating the octal and hexadecimal value fields. Let's go back over to our zip file. So looking at those connections, I can see that currently that connection is set, but I'd like to look to see if there's another event that might show me when the value changes. Now, looking at the values that are here, you may see the one at the bottom, value changed, and feel like, oh, if I simply were to connect that to decimal value changed, that might solve my problem. But in fact, it will not. The value changed event only occurs after editing completes, and then only if the value that now resides in that text field is different from the value that was there originally. So it doesn't track the actual edit motions. Instead, it only checks the resulting value to the original value and evaluates for change. That's not quite what we want, because it won't fire until after editing finishes. Let's disconnect that. The one that we do want is this one right here, editing changed. And to make that connection, I could do as I had just done with the value changed, and simply click from the connection and drag it to the file's owner, which is that pseudo object, the metaphor that just represents the view controller itself. And I could connect it to decimal value changed. But there are other ways to approach this. I'd like to remind you of something we said in the last episode, and to do that, I'm going to move this inspector out of the way and bring up our assistant editor. Remember that with the assistant editor, I can right-click and drag over into the interface and actually drop in a connection to, for instance, a new outlet. Now, if I make that change, I can choose or make that an outlet or an action. And when I make it an action, I also can choose which event that happens on, like editing changed, and I could assign it a new value. But I don't really want a new value. What I'd like to do is connect it to decimal value changed. How do I do that? But let me cancel out of that, and again right-click and drag to decimal value changed. Notice that when I highlight decimal value changed, it acts differently than pointing to an empty space. In an empty space, it will offer to create a new outlet or action, but if I highlight an existing action, it will allow me to create a new connection. However, you may notice that nothing really appears to have changed, and it did not prompt me to find out what I wanted to see. So let's come on over to our inspector again, and we can see in the Connections Inspector that actually nothing has changed. So how would I tell it I want to create a new connection, but not for the default action, for an additional action or an event? Well, to do that, we'll bring back up that Assistant Editor, and this time instead of right-clicking and dragging, let's right-click. If you simply right-click, you again get your Connections Inspector, and now we can simply click and drag from the Editing Changed to that same IB action and create the additional connection. Let's close this up, save our changes, and restart the emulator, and see whether or not that effectively makes the adjustment that we were looking for. So with that change made, we will again click inside of the field and, oh, look, as soon as I begin making changes, I can see that the values are updating in the other fields. So we have solved that problem. There is a second difficult problem, or somewhat difficult problem if you're new to iOS and Cocoa programming. It is that the keyboard doesn't go away. So if I click outside of the field, or if I click into another field, the keyboard remains on the screen. Maybe even if I hit the return key. No. Maybe the escape key. No. So how do I make that keyboard disappear off the screen? Well, to deal with that problem, we need to discuss the first responder. The first responder is going to be the UI element that is currently dealing with events that are occurring on the screen. When you click in a text field, as we had done in this particular application, as soon as you do so, it becomes and makes itself the first responder. And when that happens, its activity, its built-in behavior, is to pop that keyboard up onto the screen. We can actually control which keyboard that is, too. Let's go back into our inspector and this time take a look at the different kinds of attributes that we have on the object. And you can see that when we do that and scroll down just a little bit, we can choose which keyboard to use. For a decimal value, it might make sense to simply use a number pad. So if I make that one small change, we'll now find that when the emulator starts up, instead of seeing a full keyboard, we will only have the number pad when we click in that particular field. Here it is. I click in the field, and in fact, I only have a number pad. So that's great. If I move to one of the other fields, though, oh, it switches to the keyboard. But still, even though I'm changing the keyboard now, it's still not going away. Well, to make that happen, let's finish our discussion of that first responder. You see, since the first responder becomes the UI text field, there is no activity currently that's telling that UI text field to resign as the first responder. To make that change, let's add a little function here, a little response that we'd like to occur, and this one's going to happen when we actually finish editing in that text field. Now currently, if we were to take a look at our connections here, you'll see that the editing did end is connected to decimal value changed. Let's change that. Let's connect it to something else. So I'm going to insert a new action for editing did end, and we're going to call this one finished editing. Wonderful. Now, the existing connection to the decimal value changed is still in place. You can actually have multiple connections. And I'm going to leave that one in place for now, though since I'm also dealing with editing changed, I could actually disconnect that value to continue, but I'll leave it alone for now. Having made that connection, if I switch to my implementation, you'll see, of course, that it has added in that value that action field down here for me to act on. And so all I need to do now is tell the UI text field that it is finished being the first responder. How do I do that? Well, I would need to get my hands on that UI text field object. It turns out that that's very easy to do, because the UI text field object is actually what will be set as the sending object. So if I simply use the sender and say, sender, resign first responder, whoops, oh, little error there. Actually, I deleted the word sender. So the sender value is actually going to be the UI text field object that initiated this event. Since there's only one object connected to it right now, that's always going to be that decimal text field. So if I simply tell the sender to resign first responder, and let me get rid of that extra set of braces there, save that and run it, we now have that text field set. It brings up the values. If I tab, well, I can't really tell if it's working or not. The reason is that the hex value is also a possible first responder, but additionally, I'd really like that keyboard to resign when I hit the Enter key, and that is currently not happening. So how could I resolve that problem? Well, let's quit out of this again, and we're going to add in a little bit more capability. And to do this, I'm going to switch out of the Assistant Editor and start by going over into that the interface file for this particular object. Now, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. I actually prefer to keep all of my actions in one place and all of my properties somewhere else. So we'll bring those together. And what we need to do is make a little adjustment here. What we'd like to do is configure things so that when events occur on that UI text field, it automatically lets the view controller know about that. What we're really trying to do is nominate the view controller as a delegate. Now, the delegate model is a very common model and one you should become very comfortable with doing OS X or iOS programming. In order to understand the delegate, you can simply think of it like this. Let's say that you're a UI text field, and you're busy sitting on a screen and taking care of activities. And rather than getting distracted when someone wants your attention or someone needs to do something after an event occurs, what you'd really like to do is set a delegate who will act on your behalf. And that's exactly what a delegate does for us. In order to do that, we need to make sure that the object that will act as our delegate is able to conform to all of the requirements for the communication that a delegate would perform. For instance, if you had a press secretary for the president, you would expect that you can ask him questions about foreign policy and he'll know the answer. But if you put someone up there as the press secretary and he can't answer foreign policy questions, clearly he does not speak the right language. He's not able to speak the right protocol. So, within Objective-C, one of the things that we can do is define a protocol, and really what we're saying is this particular object here, this view controller, implements that protocol or conforms to it. If you ask it questions dealing with that kind of communication, it will be able to provide you an answer. The way you do that is simply within braces, less than and greater than signs, to simply define what that protocol is. The protocol that we're looking for in this case is this one right here, the UI text field delegate protocol. In other words, we're saying that this particular view controller, this UI view controller class view controller, this instance of that, or this example of that class, implements this protocol. Well, that's great, but how do we actually make that happen? In order to make it happen, I'm going to bring back up the view here for the Attributes Inspector, and while I'm selecting UI text field delegate, you'll notice that over here on the right, I have the ability to take a look with the quick help at the UI text field header, where that's defined, or at the UI text field delegate protocol reference. Let's take a look at the UI text field header. Now, when I first open that, it might look a little bit scary, but if I scroll down just a little bit, you'll see that here's where the protocol is defined. And underneath that protocol, we're looking for two things. We might find that there are required attributes or required functions that we must implement on behalf of that protocol, but there are other selectors that are optional. And looking at this, we can see a variety that are quite useful for us. Two in particular. We're looking for the one that says UI text field did end or should end editing. Should end means that we're about to do it, but the did end means we have just finished editing in that text field. So let's take that one to start with. I definitely need that. So I'll make a copy of that, move on over here to my implementation, and I'm simply going to move that down to the bottom. And let's see, I think I left off. Oh, this is where the definition happens. So let me change that from an interface definition to the actual activities that we'll be performing, the actual implementation of that selector. And let's go back now and take a look, because there's another one we need. This one right here. Notice it says called when the return key is pressed, return no to ignore. Well, this sounds like something I need, because I'd like that keyboard to shut down when the return key is hit. So again, I'll simply copy that, go back to my implementation, and I'm going to paste that in. Now, I'm going to make a couple of other housekeeping changes along the way. First, we'll make this into an implementation rather than an interface definition. And actually, let me hang on to that comment. That could be useful in the future. I may wonder what this function does. And what I need to do certainly is return a value. And in this case, I think that I really do want to ignore that this has happened, but I'm going to want to take some action when it does. All right, so that's great. But a little more housekeeping I'd like to do. I'm going to put a little pragma mark. And what I'm going to say is that this is where the UI text field delegate protocol functions. So by making that change, what's really happening? Well, you have the ability to cruise around inside of your implementation here by using this quick jump option. And you'll see that by simply creating that pragma, I now have a section within my implementation file with this label. So it gives you a quick way to be able to jump down to that section of your file and allows you to use good organization within your implementation files. All right, so I've got these two functions here. Now, what needs to happen within them? Well, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to use the finished editing function to implement this. So I'm simply going to call the finished editing, the function I've already created for this purpose, and I need to send it who's making the change. And the person making the change is going to be the text field value that's being passed in. And additionally, I'd like to call that same function, finished editing, with the text field value that's being passed in here whenever those functions are called. Now, you might ask, couldn't I simply copy the resign first responder and put that into each one of these functions so that I would have text field, like this, text field, resign first responder? And the answer is, of course I could. However, it is generally considered to be much, much better secure coding practice to have simply one function that's going to take care of that. Just like if you were creating memory management code, you would only want to have one place in your code where your memory is allocated and one place where it's deallocated. Similarly, if you're creating a function, you would really prefer to have just a single point within that function from which all of the returns are handled, rather than having returns throughout the code. Well, for the same reason, we'd really like to do that resignation of the first responder in just one place, just to keep our code a little bit cleaner and for future troubleshooting kinds of problems, especially as code gets refactored. Well, let's start up our application again and see whether or not we've resolved this particular problem. In order to, actually, I know we haven't because I did forget to do something, so let me quit back out of that. What I forgot to do is I need to set the delegate for that. Right now, there's no delegate configured for this particular object. If I right-click, you can see that there is a delegate connection that's possible, and I could drag that over to Files Owner, which is the view controller, and is exactly what I need to do. By doing that, I have just nominated the view controller, or designated it, as the delegate for that particular field. That means that when I click in this field and make a change, and then press the Enter key, that event, the Enter key, the text field should return event or function call in that protocol gets called. And you can see that simply by hitting the Enter key, it disappears. That also means, though, that if I were additionally to tab out of the field, it is resigning. However, remember that these do not currently have a delegate set. So I could very, very quickly simply create a delegate reference for each one of these over to the Files Owner. Let's just do that. So with no other changes, there we go. Pull our delegate over here. Let's just save that and run it again. And now, in addition to finding that the decimal value field will behave correctly when we make changes in it or exit out of the field or press Enter, we should find that the same is true of the other fields. So still, I can make a change here, hit Enter. I can click into a field, it brings up a keyboard, but hitting the Enter key, that field will also resign first responder. Now, these fields still don't make any changes, but we'll make some of those coding changes later on in our application development process. We'll also take a look at a very common thing that you can do so that it would be possible for a user to tap out of the field and make it resign first responder too.